My name is Katie Erickson, and I am the Director of Education here at the Carlos. And I would like to take a moment to share the Emory University Land Acknowledgement. Emory University acknowledges the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. Tonight, we're gathered to hear from teaching professor and director of undergraduate studies and co-curator of the exhibition Recasting Antiquity, Whistler, Tanagras in the Female Form, Linda Merrill. Linda's been a wonderful longtime friend to the museum for many, many years, and we are so grateful to be able to work with her in many different capacities. Dr. Merrill has served as guest curator with the National Museum of Asian Art, worked with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and served as the Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art at the High Museum, and the Curator of American Art at the Freer Gallery, curating a variety of beautiful exhibitions and overseeing large-scale reinstallations. Her publications include Palaces of Art, Whistler and the Art Worlds of Aestheticism, The Peacock Room, a Cultural Biography, With Kindest Regards, The Correspondence of Charles Lang Freer and James McNeill Whistler, and After Whistler, The Artist and His Influence on American Painting, to name only a few. In tonight's lecture, we'll learn about the models who inspired many of the artists in their time, including Whistler and his wife Beatrix, the Pettigrew sisters, with Rosie Pettigrew serving as the primary muse for his series of Tanagra-inspired lithographs that many of you were able to see in the exhibition before you came in tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Merrill.
Thank you, Katie. Trilby, the runaway bestseller of 1894, was the first English novel to bear the name of an artist's model. Today, the story is remembered mainly for its villain, Svengali, who held hypnotic power over Trilby O'Farrell and could transform her in an instant from tone deaf to a diva. In its own time, however, the book's fascination lay in its tantalizing glimpses of studio life in Bohemian Paris, where British rules of propriety did not apply. As the author informed his friend Henry James, Trilby was not for little girls. Not only does the heroine pose for the figure, or in the nude, or as she herself phrases it, in the altogether, but Trilby is a woman with a past, exactly as Du Maurier's Victorian readers would expect of an artist's model. Because of her sullied reputation, she cannot marry the man she loves, a respectable English artist known as Little Billy. And in the end, in keeping with the convention of melodrama, she dies. 2 pages later, his heartbroken Little Billy follows her to the grave. As a novel, Trilby is neither particularly original nor altogether coherent, yet the book became a popular and commercial sensation with numerous theatrical and later film adaptations. The explanation for its phenomenal success lies in the timing of its appearance, just as public curiosity about the private lives of artists reached its peak. In fact, it was during the Trilby craze that certain English models featured in London exhibitions, not just as figures in paintings, but as sitters in portraits, celebrities in their own right, valued participants in the grand enterprise of art making. None were more renowned in their time than the 3 sisters Pettigrew, who were, by their own account, the best paid posers in England. Although they can be unrecognizable in the works for which they posed, we have documentary evidence to prove that they modeled steadily for at least 20 late Victorian artists. One of those whose works abound in images of the Mrs. Pettigrew is the American aestheticist painter James McNeill Whistler. Though born in Lowell, Massachusetts, Whistler's life as an artist had begun in Paris, where he went to study on the day he turned 21. George du Maurier, the author of Trilby, was one of Whistler's art student friends, and his novel is largely based on his own reminiscences of the Latin Quarter in the 1850s. Joe Sibley, who looks and sounds a lot like Whistler, is one of du Maurier's memorable characters. He is described as the idle apprentice, an insult for which Whistler threatened to take the author to court. He might have won the case, for Whistler was never idle a day in his life. He did, however, neglect his studies when he fell under the influence of Gustave Courbet and the realist movement. Unlike Du Maurier, who would forever remain in the middle of the road, Whistler eagerly joined the avant-garde in exultant opposition to the artistic establishment. Rather than making studies from life or drawing nude models in the master's studio, as might be expected of an apprentice artist at that time, Whistler elected to take his subject matter from the real life he found in the streets of Paris. These etchings from 1858, for example, portray a tinker and a flower seller, urban women who appeal to Whistler's realist sympathies. When he resettled in London in 1859, Whistler took up with a working-class Irish woman named Joanna Heffernan, shown here in an etching called Weary. Heffernan was an amateur model, meaning that she posed for love rather than money. Jo Heffernan assumes another Weary pose in The White Girl, later retitled Symphony in White. Wearing an anachronistic dress and trampling a bearskin rug, Jo impersonates a professional artist model who has dropped her pose along with her posy at the end of a long, hard day. Contemporary critics fail to comprehend Whistler's conceit of an out-of-character model and struggle to find the narrative illustrated by the painting. One writer read Heffernan's cambric frock as a wedding dress and construed her drained expression as the result of a traumatic loss of innocence. Yet Whistler's interest as a realist lay in the working model herself, who earned a shilling an hour to stand immobile for long periods of time, holding a set expression. As the portrayal of a modern artist model, The White Girl so confounded contemporary audiences that it was refused by both the Royal Academy in London and the Paris Salon, though exhibited in 1863 at the notorious Salon des Refusés. There it became one of two paintings that attracted public disapprobation. The other was Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass. Manet, like Whistler at this stage in his career, was a realist painter dedicated to depicting scenes from modern life, and Luncheon on the Grass, like The White Girl, pictured an artist's model. We can identify her from her attribute, the pile of discarded clothing by her side. Although nudes were commonplace in exhibitions, the modern context of this painting offended every standard of propriety. Moreover, the naked woman turns away from the picnic in a Paris park to catch the eye of the beholder. If the stricken features of Whistler's woman in white seemed shockingly suggestive, the unabashed expression of Manet's nude was brazen and impertinent. Within a few years of the White Girl's exhibition at the Salon des Refusés, Whistler repudiated the painting, together with other works produced under what he now regarded as the odious influence of Gustave Courbet and the realist movement. He felt he had exhausted the possibilities of realism, and he blamed Courbet for his own educational deficiencies. "I'm sure I'll make up for the time I've wasted," he confided to his friend Henri Fontaine-Latour. "But what difficulties. I spend the whole day drawing from models." Drawing from models, the traditional practice of making academy studies from the nude figure, must have seemed especially tedious to Whistler, who was already a proficient painter with an extraordinary command of color. He might never have persevered were it not for his new friend, Albert Moore. While Whistler had been depicting scenes from modern life, Moore was tending toward antiquity, conjuring visions of pristine beauty remote from the contemporary world. With his meticulous working methods and high aesthetic ideals, he represented the very antithesis, and for Whistler, the antidote to realism. To carry out his remedial project, Whistler rented a studio at 62 Great Russell Street, overlooking the forecourt of the British Museum, where the architectural sculpture from the Parthenon was housed. For Whistler and his contemporaries, and for many people even today, the Elgin marbles represented the summit of artistic achievement, the best and highest, as one Victorian lecturer expressed its ineffable distinction, never likely or even possible to be excelled in any future age of the world. In the intimidating shadow of that epitome of perfection, Whistler attempted to formulate an original approach to ideal or abstract beauty. The academic drawings he produced at this time, in keeping with the seriousness of his enterprise, are self-consciously solemn and staid. Standing Nude, for example, sometimes called Venus, is cold and disaffected, an over-determined attempt to capture the calm repose of classical art. The figure's awkward stance and blank expression convey Whistler's own discomfort with both the nude and the preparatory practices he was trying to adopt from Albert Moore. In the oil painting for which the cartoon was made, the figure was to be clothed, or at least, as Whistler informed a potential patron, clad in thin, transparent drapery. In this little oil sketch, we see the figure, now fully draped, holding a circular fan, an unexpected accessory that emblematizes the new wave of inspiration flowing from Japan. Whistler abandoned his painting in 1869 when Moore exhibited his own interpretation of the Venus theme, a mirror image of the Venus de Milo with arms. Whistler himself had nothing ready for exhibition that year. Deeply indebted to Moore, he was anxious about his own originality and almost incapacitated by his perfectionism, exacerbated by the prolonged encounter with the classical ideal looming across the street in the British Museum. It was time to try something new. One day in 1871, when Whistler was prepared to proceed with a canvas depicting a group of classically draped figures, the professional model he had hired failed to show up, as models often did. Whistler was determined to work anyway, so he turned the canvas over and asked his mother to pose instead. Because she tired quickly, he brought her a footstool, invited her to sit down, arranged her hands around a handkerchief, and positioned her body in profile, facing left, in contrast to convention, so that the dignified widow appeared to be reflecting on her past. In this austere and elegant work, Anna Whistler represents both model and sitter, a figure in the composition formerly titled Arrangement in Gray and Black, and the subject of a portrait, as noted in the subtitle. As Whistler would later explain to the artist Henry Tonks, the painting interested him as a portrait of his mother, but to anyone else, he said, its beauty could be just as well seen if they looked at it upside down. Whistler's new approach to painting reconciled the two strains of his art. The subject was drawn from the world around him, in keeping with the realist mandate to depict modern life, but the painting itself was composed with such exquisite attention to color and form that the image of reality was imbued with the beauty of art. Moreover, by painting arrangements, Whistler freed himself from the need to hire studio models. Arrangement in White and Black, for example, depicts Maud Franklin, who succeeded Joe Heffernan as the artist's domestic partner and amateur model. It was not until the mid-1880s, after a tumultuous decade of personal and artistic triumph and despair, that Whistler finally returned to figure studies. At first, he built upon the academic works executed in the 1860s and early 70s in atonement for his misspent youth. Infrared photographs show that for this pastel, for instance, he simply modified an earlier drawing by adding color and updating his butterfly signature. So what accounts for his abrupt return to the earlier studio works? Tanagra figurines. Tanagra is the generic name for mold-made terracotta statuettes from ancient Greece, produced during the Hellenistic era. The most popular type was the standing female figure, extravagantly draped, wearing an elaborate hairstyle, sometimes a veil or a sun hat, striking an insouciant pose and occasionally holding a fan. Large numbers of the figurines were unearthed in the early 1870s near the ancient city of Tanagra. They became widely known and wildly popular after their exhibition in Paris at the Universal Exposition of 1878. Although Whistler was never explicit about the inspiration, he hinted at the artistic significance of the Tanagras in an 1885 lecture, which he titled The 10 O'Clock, after the late night hour of its presentation. His purpose was to affirm the sanctity and privilege of art for art's sake, which he envisioned as, quote, a goddess of dainty thought, reticent of habit, abjuring all obtrusiveness, proposing in no way to better others. Like a Tanagra figurine, Whistler's muse was classical in her allegorical aspect, but markedly human in her inconstant attentions and capricious affections, which the artist had learned to his grief never to take for granted. Her strong sense of joy tolerates no dullness, he asserts in the 10 O'Clock, and live we never so spotlessly, still may she turn her back upon us. We might expect to find Tanagras somewhere in the discourse of the 10 O'Clock, but Whistler never mentions them by name, perhaps because they were by then so much in vogue, and he instinctively recoiled from the vulgarity of popular fashion. His monologue even criticizes the tendency among his contemporaries to favor the classical above every other mode of beauty. Oscar Wilde, Whistler's neighbor in a new artistic enclave in Chelsea, seized upon this flicker of hypocrisy, writing in response, has not Tite Street been thrilled with the tidings that the models of Chelsea were posing to the master in peplums for pastels? The models were not, in fact, posing in peplums, a word meant to recall the peplos, or outer garment worn in ancient Greece. They were posing in the nude, or, as often, lightly draped in pale, transparent silks. As one critic noted dryly of the artist's pastels of the period, their excessively slight drapery is the result of some half-dozen strokes of the crayon. These pastels may have been inspired by the growing publicity surrounding the polychromy of Tanagra figurines. Though muted by time, the vestiges of pigment clinging to their terracotta surfaces contributed to their charm. In an age obsessed with the myth of Pygmalion, even the hint of color on an antique statue made it seem to come alive, or at least appear more personable than the cold white marbles in the British Museum. The American neoclassical sculptor William Wetmore Story, upon seeing a selection of Whistler's pastels in 1885, exclaimed, "They are as charming and complete as a Tanagra statue." The analogy may have been prompted by works such as Study in Red. Its French title, meaning the Athenian dancer, provides a clue to its probable inspiration, the famous terracotta known in the 19th century as the T2 dancer, a figurine discovered by Philippe T2 in 1846 on the Athenian Acropolis. In the 19th century, the T2 dancer was known to artists and antiquarians throughout Europe, and Whistler was surely familiar with it, or one of the countless reproductions circulating at the time, for he clearly recalls the veiled figure with his own dancing girl, arms akimbo, one toe pointing forward. One contemporary critic described Whistler's pastels from this period as very slight in themselves, dignified and graceful in line, and charmingly chaste. Whistler's small-scale works on paper were thereby distinguished from the many life-size Venuses that had begun to crowd the walls of annual exhibitions. The Victorian nude, once considered an oxymoron, had come into its own, ostensibly in response to a rising interest in classical archaeology. Edward J. Poynter's Diadumene, for example, was based on the Esquiline Venus, which had been discovered in Rome in 1874. In response to the proliferation of such paintings, a writer identified only as a British matron wrote to the Times in 1885 to protest the display of nudity at the two principal galleries of modern art in London. A flurry of correspondence followed as artists and laypeople weighed in on the matron's assumption that drapery and virtue were inextricably related. Waged in the pages of the Times, the matron's assault posed little danger to the artist's autonomy, but the threat was heightened when an establishment insider, a royal academician named John Halcott Horsley, took up the campaign for purity in art. In a widely publicized speech, Horsley accused his fellow artists of debasing young girls by inducing them, quote, so to ignore their natural modesty and quench their sense of true shame as to expose their nakedness before men and thus destroy all that is pure and lovely in their womanhood. Thus, he appended the British matron's moral outrage to a plea for social reform. Behind every nude picture, Horsley averred, lay a woman posing naked for a pittance, scarcely better than a prostitute. Horsley's position was parodied by Edward Linley Sanborn, a political cartoonist for the popular periodical Punch. In Sanborn's drawing of the model British matron, the proselytizing Horsley, posed and dressed as the anonymous author of the letter to the Times, recoils in horror from the Medici Venus and mutters anxiously, oh dear, who could have sat for that? Whistler, too, was keen to twit Horsley, as he put it, about the nude and his absurd onslaught on it. When some of his own figure drawings, casually clad in pastel, went on view at the Society of British Artists, he affixed to one frame a label imprinted, Horsley soit qui mal y pense. Though now abstruse, the quip would have been understood in its time as a play on the motto of the chivalric Order of the Garter, which means shame on anyone who thinks evil of it. A well-intentioned journalist interpreted Whistler's inscription as an indignant protest against the idea that there is any immorality in the nude. But the artist's objection was more sweeping than that. To Whistler, the debate over the propriety of the nude took to an extreme conclusion the misguided conflation of art and morality that had long encumbered British art. For him, the nude figure, far from representing immorality, embodied art in its purest, most perfectly impractical form. In the end, the moral controversy incited by the British matron and fomented by poor Clothes Horsley, as he inevitably became known, had little effect on the production of the Victorian nude. Its principal outcome was to move the model out of the studio and into the realm of public debate and popular attention. Until that time, the artist model in England had remained effectively invisible. Respectable painters even designed their studios with separate entrances so that models could come and go without being seen by other members of the household. In the context of the paintings for which they posed, models were understood only in terms of the characters they portrayed, and nudity was tolerated only when it was the costume of a Grecian goddess, like Aphrodite, or a biblical bather, like Susanna, never in a setting or as part of any story associated with modern life. That paradigm was shattered in 1887 by Hetty Pettigrew, whose image in this painting, naked and large as life, created a scandal upon its exhibition at the New English Art Club. Theodore Roussel's Reading Girl was the first modern life nude painted in England. Hetty plays the part of an artist model who has dropped her pose, a conceit perhaps adapted from The White Girl, as Roussel considered himself Whistler's protege. Yet here Hetty plays herself, a professional model resting in a studio chair, buried, as one critic remarked, but the British matron will regret to find not hidden in the newspaper. Although the painting has the polish of a French salon nude, the model herself is rough and realistic. Her reddened hands betray her class. This is a woman who washes her own clothes and dishes. And her calloused feet suggest her slavery to fashion, tightly laced, pointed-toed, high-heeled boots. There has been no attempt to idealize the figure, one critic complained. It is simply a portrait of a rather underfed woman who is content at $1 an hour to be naked and not ashamed. Indeed, as in Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, it was the model's lack of shame that most unsettled the critics. As surely as her underfed form defied the prevailing preference for the plump, her apparent ease with her own nakedness, especially in the presence of a male artist, contradicted Victorian ideals of femininity. Whistler considered Roussel's Reading Girl an extraordinary picture and responded with one of his own, titled Little Nude Model Reading, an adaptation of the theme to the more intimate and spontaneous medium of lithography. Whistler's model rests on the edge of a cabinet, reading intently, unaware of the artist or the viewer. Reading seems to have been the preferred activity of models between poses, as we learned from Oscar Wilde, who published a pseudo-anthropological study of London models in 1889. When they are tired, he wrote, a wise artist gives them a rest. Then they sit in a chair and read penny dreadfuls till they are roused from the tragedy of literature to take their place in the tragedy of art. Apart from the scarf constraining her hair, Whistler's model wears not a stitch of clothing, though the heap of draperies on the tabletop behind her suggests that she was previously dressed or would be soon again. Here, paradoxically, as in Roussel's Reading Girl and Whistler's White Girl, the model must stop posing before we can see her as a model, as distinct from the impersonal image of a generic body known as the figure. This model, as it happens, is Hetty Pettigrew's little sister, Rosie. Her grandnephew, Neil Pettigrew, has positively identified her on the evidence of her nose, which by Rosie's own account started straight but changed its mind by turning up at the tip. Such identification is possible only in these earliest studio lithographs, for Whistler later disguises his model's every distinguishing characteristic. Rose Pettigrew, about 15 when she began working for Whistler, wrote her memoirs some 60 years after the events they describe. Her account is not altogether accurate, especially where dates and ages are concerned, but it provides an invaluable view of the Pettigrew's rise to renown in the London art world. Rosie and her sisters were born in Portsmouth, off the south coast of England, where in the early 1880s they were living with their widowed mother on the verge of destitution. Their brother Henry, the eldest of the many Pettigrew children still at home and the only boy, offered little assistance to the household because he had recently become an art student, and rather a poor one, according to his sister. One day, or so the story goes, Henry's drawing master paid a call at the Pettigrew residence and caught sight of 3 little girls clinging to their mother's skirts. Aware of the family's impoverished condition, he suggested to Mrs. Pettigrew that she was in possession of a veritable fortune, explaining that plenty of artists in London would pay well to paint her pretty daughters. The Pettigrew's mother drew back in horror, objecting that her late husband had been related to the Mount Edgecombes of Cornwall, meaning that her children were too well bred to consider such a disreputable profession. But she relented when the teacher pointed out that only by allowing her daughters to pose for respectable artists could she save them from the worser fate of running the streets or entering a life of prostitution. And so, as Rosie recorded in her memoirs, the little family moved to London town, armed with letters of introduction from the kindly drawing master, together with a recent Royal Academy catalogue listing the names and addresses of the most famous artists of the day. As luck would have it, their first engagement was with John Everett Millais, a founding member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood who had become a prominent figure in the Victorian art world. The 3 sisters made their way on their own through the city streets to Millais' palatial Kensington residence. They were holding back nervous tears when the artist suddenly appeared, Rosie recollected, handsome and charming, and winning 3 trembling little hearts at once. "We must have looked a pretty picture to a man who loved children," Rosie wrote. Hetty, my elder sister, with soft, straight hair like a burnished chestnut, glorious skin, and big hazel eyes. We called them cow's eyes when we wanted to annoy her. My sister Lily, with the most beautiful curly red gold hair, violet eyes, a beautiful mouth, classic nose, and beautifully shaped face, long neck, well set, and a most exquisite figure. I was the ordinary little one, tiny, with bushels of very curly bright gold hair, a rose leaf complexion, and a cupid's bow mouth. I had an extremely pretty figure, and although that not nearly so handsome or beautiful as my sisters, was easy on the eye. We all had extremely beautiful hands. After feasting on hot chocolate and eclairs, the girls made themselves comfortable in the studio while Millet sketched the pseudo-historical picture he had in mind, a romantic scene set in Scotland during the Jacobite Rising of 1745. The girls were to enact a scene of 3 Highland lasses gazing in spellbound attention at an English soldier playing the flute, exactly the kind of sweet, sentimental picture that secured Millet's extraordinary fame and fortune. Afterward, Millet's butler brought in a basket overflowing with expensive sweets and hothouse fruits and handed each girl a silk purse containing a golden sovereign. The children floated home on a cloud of contentment, and their mother nearly fainted when she saw the money and delicacies they had so easily earned. And so the days continued until at last Millet completed the painting, leaving them all in tears as they said goodbye to what Rosie maintained was the happiest time of their lives. Though not an unqualified success, an idyll of 1845 sent critics into raptures over the 3 little maidens. Mr. Millet, one wrote, has never painted a sweeter group. And afterward, the Pettigrews never wanted for work. We posed to every great artist in the land, Rosie recollected. In fact, we became the rage among artists and found it quite easy to earn a very large sum between us, my little mother finding it just as easy to spend it. The next year, Millet hired the golden-haired Lily to pose in the foreground of a picture of an ornithologist called The Ruling Passion, which he considered one of his finest works. Rosie, meanwhile, at age 13, posed for the sculptor Alfred Gilbert, best known today for his statue of Eros at the center of Piccadilly Circus. She disrobed for the part of an adolescent girl, timidly making an offering to the god of marriage. Hetty, after the succès du scandale of The Reading Girl, became Roussel's principal model. She also became his studio assistant and his mistress, not necessarily in that order, and eventually earned enough to move out of the Fulham flat she shared with her mother, whose voracious demands for money Hetty was beginning to resent. Roussel's works on paper abound in demonstrative images of Hetty Pettigrew, including casual dry points of her nude figure, a lyrical series of lithographs made by lamplight, and a picture of her in a luxurious robe with a mandarin collar, possibly an homage to Whistler's 1864 Long Elizon of the 6 Marks. Of the 3 sisters, Hetty seems to have been the most in demand. We know that she posed for Sir Frederick Leighton, the illustrious president of the Royal Academy, possibly for the Frigidarium, and that Leighton shared her with the sculptor Hamo Thornycroft, his Holland Park neighbor. Thornycroft's diaries note over 100 sittings with one or another of the Pettigrews, who were paid a generous 11 shillings a day plus cab fare. But the sculptor was especially smitten with Eddie, as he and other artists called Hetty, condescendingly, because of her habit of dropping her H's. Upon first meeting Hetty Pettigrew, Thornycroft recorded in his diary that she possessed a head very like the Oxford bust, a reference to a then famous Roman marble head and torso of a woman. It was probably under that inspiration that Thornycroft sculpted a bust of Hetty called April, now lost, and later a medallion, casting her head in profile. The medal commemorated her engagement to one of Thornycroft's studio assistants, the Glasgow sculptor John Tweed, who eventually threw her over for a woman with more wealth and social status. It may have been on Roussel's recommendation that the Pettigrews went to work for Whistler. Unlike Millet, whose opulent studio in Kensington offered the models unparalleled luxury and comfort, Whistler occupied a barn-like studio in the Fulham Road that backed onto the Walham Green railway station. Rosie recollected that all 3 sisters posed for Whistler, who was very clever and cynical, she said, loving to say smart things, even if they hurt. He met his match in Hetty and was amused, Rosie remembered, by her cleverly cruel sayings, even when it went against himself. Hetty is most likely the Miss Pettigrew who posed in a large cloak and broad-brimmed hat for this etching of 1887, and she probably appears here as well with her younger sister Lily, reading by the stove to keep warm in the drafty studio, one of them perched on a stool reading a book. Indeed, judging from the works made in their image, the Pettigrews were always resting in Whistler's studio, either reading novels, or reading tea leaves, or just sitting quietly, waiting for something to happen. And even though a model's occupation technically depends on her ability to stand still, to not move, Whistler delighted in showing the Pettigrews in motion, or at least charged with its potential, as in Dancing Girl, in which the model gingerly points one toe like the T2 dancer and extends one arm to release a cascade of drapery. What we do not see in these images is evidence of work, of a model holding a difficult pose for an hourly wage. We know from the Australian artist Mortimer Memphis, who frequented Whistler's studio in this period, that the artist never prescribed the artificial attitudes that Victorian models were typically expected to assume. There was no pulling about of drapery, Memphis recalled, no gazing through arched hands, no special placing of the body. For Whistler, even the suggestion of effort would have undermined the easy aestheticist spirit of his art. In fact, not even the drapery is allowed to perform its expected purpose in these pictures. Neither a costume nor a disguise, the diaphanous fabric functions only to remove the model from the mundane, to evoke a sense of timelessness rather than suggest an era of classical antiquity. By doing away with poses that presume a plot and costumes that define a character, Whistler unveils the model, allowing her to feature in his works as an undisguised element in the process of art making. To his way of thinking, a picture of a female model is a picture of nothing, a subjectless work of art incapable of being regarded on any but its own formal terms. By calling attention to the model, he presents the work of art as a work of art, a pleasing image on a fragile piece of paper, not a magical window opening onto a fictive world. Now, by bringing the model forward in this way, Whistler's Tanagra images might be expected to exploit the contemporary fascination with bohemian life that made a sensation of Du Maurier's Trilby, yet Whistler's works could only disappoint the popular craving for tales from the artist's studio. Looking back, it seems contrarian of Whistler to choose the most famous models of the day for abstract images that allied their identities. But he recognized that the Pettigrews as models were as talented as they were beautiful, capable of performing the little rituals of daily life with an utter lack of self-consciousness. Young and lithesome and cheerful and witty, they also brought joy to the studio. A series of photographs taken by Linley Sambourne, the illustrator for Punch who had immortalized the British matron, provides a visual record of their spirited personalities. Sambourne engaged Hetty and Lily Pettigrew at least 10 times between 1889 and 1892, resulting in nearly 300 photographs. If Sambourne paid them less than they would have earned from a painter or a sculptor, he made fewer demands on their time and energy, as they were required to hold their poses only as long as it took him to open and close the shutter. Sambourne, the great-grandfather of the British photographer Lord Snowdon, had taken up photography as a practical matter, as what he called a useful adjunct to his art. Because he was compelled to churn out weekly cartoons on topical issues, he often lacked the time to arrange for sittings with professional models. His solution was to hire them for extended photo sessions in which he took scores of pictures in a wide variety of poses, with the models often draped in quasi-Grecian garb to render them suitable for allegorical figures. He could then use the figures as reference photographs when opportunity allowed to fashion his cartoons. Here, for instance, we see Hetty Pettigrew striking a pose that lent itself to a figure in Sambourne's Aesop Up to Date of 1892. Yet Sambourne's obsession with photographing the Pettigrews seems to have exceeded the purely professional, for he took even more pictures of them in the nude, adding to the enormous secret archive he made, presumably for his personal delectation. In her memoirs, Rosie Pettigrew fails to name the year that she and her sisters began working for Whistler, but she gives a clue in the sly comment that they had known several of Whistler's wives. This suggests that their earliest sittings took place while Maud Franklin, who liked to be called Mrs. Whistler, was still in the picture, probably in 1887, as Whistler married Beatrix Godwin in 1888. Despite his long-lasting relationships with Joe Heffernan and Maud Franklin, Whistler had remained a bachelor until the age of 54. "I don't marry," he used to say, "but I tolerate those who do." His bride, age 31, was the daughter of the sculptor John Burney Phillip and the widow of the architect and designer Edward W. Godwin, who had been one of Whistler's closest friends and most respected colleagues. Beatrix had worked for Godwin before she married him at age 18, and her earliest works include painted panels adorned with birds for the art furniture that Godwin designed. By 1881, though the mother of a small child, Beatrix felt sufficiently secure in her occupation to list it in the census as artist painting. One day in 1885, Whistler called at the Godwin residence and chanced to see a small figure painting by Beatrix, now lost, called Lamplight. He was so impressed, Godwin afterward reported, that he took it away to show as a work of a pupil of his own. Even though she had previously exhibited works under her own name, or rather her husband's, as Mrs. E.W. Godwin, Beatrix was persuaded to adopt the gender-neutral pseudonym Rix Burney for her debut with the Society of British Artists. In the exhibition catalog, she's listed as Whistler's pupil, along with one Clifton Lynn, the alias of Maud Franklin. In reality, Beatrix Godwin was not yet Whistler's pupil, though she had spent many hours in his studio posing for the full-length portrait Harmony in Red Lamplight, in which she stands tall and confident, gazing at the artist with loving eyes. She and Godwin were by then estranged, and his health had been failing since 1885. After his death in October 1886, Whistler started a petition to raise funds for advance to Mrs. Godwin to enable her to take an assured position as an artist. As a result, Beatrix spent time studying art in Paris and with Whistler in London, so that by 1888 she was described by a journalist as a remarkably clever artist and decorative draftsman. Perhaps as part of her artistic re-education, Beatrix made studies from the female nude. She worked on a larger scale than Whistler and in a more naturalistic and emphatic style. Her nude model with an open fan, for example, might be compared to Whistler's watercolor of the tall flower. The figure's pose is slightly different, and Whistler's treatment of the nude, partly owing to the watercolor medium, is more delicate and tentative. Beatrix portrays the model with an open fan at her side, as if to suggest that nothing was to be concealed. The model's downcast eyes indicate feminine modesty, lending a touch of irony to this frank image of female nudity. The model for both works was Rosie Pettigrew, who began posing for Beatrix before her marriage to Whistler. We see Rose again in this small oil called Peach Blossom, wearing one of the dresses that Beatrix is known to have made for her model, which sets the picture's color scheme in Whistlerian fashion. Peach Blossom may be seen as a more conventional and ladylike rendition of Whistler's little nude model reading, with Rosie now fully dressed and seated in a proper chair. Perhaps because her own child was away at boarding school, Beatrix fixed her maternal love on Rosie, who fully reciprocated her affections, and they had wonderful times together, Rosie recalled, with Beatrix remaining in the studio while she posed. The reminiscence cast a rosy glow over our understanding of Whistler's studio around 1890. It was not the transactional space envisaged by the British matron and other purity campaigners, in which girls were regularly exploited by rapacious painters, but a predominantly female space willingly occupied by three young women and the artist's new wife, whose affectionate attendance offset her husband's cool, aestheticist attachment. Whistler's own presence is marked in the pictures only by his butterfly signature, which upon his marriage he superimposed on Beatrix's trefoil monogram. A couple of years after Rosie Pettigrew began posing for the Whistlers, she embarked on her next adventure, as she called it, a long-time intimate and professional relationship with the artist Philip Wilson Steer. Though best known for his land and seascapes, Steer established his reputation with paintings of Rosie Pettigrew. She had boldly presented herself at his studio door because Steer was, Rose said, the tallest, thinnest, and best-looking man she had ever seen. She asked if he'd like to paint her, allowing that he'd have to decide right away because she posed to all the really big artists. When asked which big artist was waiting for her that day, Rosie replied that it was Whistler, and that Mrs. Whistler had made the lovely pink frock she was wearing. Now, Steer was one of Whistler's greatest admirers, but he had no intention, he said, of depicting Rose Pettigrew in Mrs. Whistler's frock and calling the painting a study in pink. Nevertheless, he invited her back to the studio the next day. Because Beatrix liked having her close by, Rosie usually went to the Whistlers every day. So when she informed them that she would henceforth be otherwise engaged once a week, there was considerable consternation in the studio. Beatrix rightly suspected that Rosie was in love, and in the suspicious way of mother figures everywhere, objected that Steer was old enough to be her father and would never make a name. After that, Rosie said, Beatrix was never quite the same toward her, wounded, the model gathered, to think that I preferred Steer to her adored Jimmy. Wilson Steer, perhaps in defiance of Beatrix Whistler pink, nearly always painted Rosie in blue, typically a dark, sprigged, or polka-dotted dress. Of the two pictures of Rosie in blue he exhibited in 1889, one of them, now lost, bore the title Pretty Rose Pettigrew, casting her image as a sentimental portrait. The painting was even mentioned in Punch, attesting to Rosie's new renown. Because it was a little above life-size, Punch commented that Steer's portrait might better be called Pretty Rosie Larger Grew. As their intimacy developed, Rosie began posing for Steer 3 days a week, without pay, for she was under the impression that he was poor. She gave Whistler the other 2 days because she needed the money. Hetty and Lily had moved out, leaving her to support her mother and younger sister. It was while posing twice a week for Whistler that Rosie began bringing her little niece, Edith, the youngest daughter of her elder brother, Alfred, with her to the studio. We see them in this color lithograph, though Rosie is hard to recognize in street clothes. In keeping with the Whistlerian theme of aesthetic ease, she takes the opportunity to close her eyes while little Edith looks directly at the artist with the remarkable self-possession that made her aunts such sought-after models. When Rosie reappears in this etching, titled Cameo Number 1, she's all draped up and ready for work, now coaxing the baby to sleep. Whistler also pursued the theme in a series of pastels in which the baby becomes a kind of studio prop for the draped models. Indeed, whenever Edith was out of sorts, the Pettigrews used a doll instead. The point of the pictures, I believe, was not to extol motherhood, but to explore the notion of woman as muse, or as nurturer, in this case, of the precious creation cultivated in the studio, the nascent work of art. This ensemble of images seemed to have held some private meaning for Whistler and his wife. They briefly considered mounting an exhibition of the Rosies, by which they meant this series of pastels. Although never realized, the scheme was under discussion in June 1891, when Whistler made a flying trip to Paris. He stopped by the gallery of Paul Durand-Ruel to see the recent works of his French colleagues, and reported to Beatrix back in London that there was an entire room full of Renoirs. "You have no idea," he said. "I don't know what has happened to the eyes of everybody. The things are simply childish." Had they been together, Whistler said, they would have held hands and summoned the memory of what he referred to as the beautiful Rosies, which the couple seemed to have regarded as a defense against bad art. The Whistlers had taken a new house in Chelsea, where the first floor drawing rooms, front and back, were converted into a single studio. According to the artist Graham Robertson, it was all that a studio should be, very bare, very untidy, yet made beautiful by the glimpse of the river from 2 tall windows. We kept sight of that artful disarray in draped figure reclining, in the fabric cast over the couch as a makeshift slipcover, and the porcelain jar resting incongruously on the cushion beside the figure's knee. The model, again, is probably Rose Pettigrew, who doesn't just recline, but falls fast asleep, her fan dangling from her fingertips. This lithograph, which was in fact highly laborious to create and color, may be Whistler's most eloquent expression of the model not at work, the idea that art's sole occupation is to be lovely to look at. Perhaps Rosie reported to Steer on the poses she took for Whistler, since Steer borrowed the theme for this painting, called The Sofa, where Rosie appears fully dressed, but evidently sound asleep. The next year, he painted another rendition, with Rosie in a more provocative pose, her lack of inhibition expressed through his own unusually loose impressionistic technique. Hetty Pettigrew, too, struck a recumbent pose in this caressing interpretation of the theme by Theodore Roussel, which hardly disguises the intimacy of their relationship. Roussel and Whistler were working closely together during this period, and as this pair of pictures suggests, exploring similar subjects and even employing the same models, occasionally at the same time. Like Whistler's earlier color lithograph, Draped Figure Reclining, this one, with the exotic title The Arabian, revels in the pretty disorder of the studio, with unprecedented attention to the richly patterned fabrics that set off the bare curves of Hetty Pettigrew's body. It must be said that the sleeping, visually accessible female figure appears frequently in all kinds of late Victorian art, as in this oil painting by John William Godward, in which Lily Pettigrew plays the part of mischief to Hetty's repose. Indeed, one advantage of looking at art through the perspective of the artist's model is that it affords a panoramic view of the period, extending from Whistler's refined reductive style to Godward's sentimental classicism, which answered the Victorian taste for luxurious ladies striking studied poses in exotic settings. The Victorian model was expected to be infinitely adaptable, as Oscar Wilde remarks in London Models. They career gaily through all centuries and through all costumes, and like actors, are only interesting when they are not themselves. Like Whistler, Godward portrayed all three Pettigrew sisters, but his favorite by far was Lily. Neil Pettigrew has identified her features in 21 of Godward's paintings, and on the basis of the visual evidence is convinced that the artist was passionately in love with his model. Tender close-up views of Lily's face are certainly persuasive, and there does seem to be an element of autobiography in works like these. In Waiting for an Answer, the young man, a self-portrait, waits to discover whether his affections will be reciprocated. Yes or no, on the right, painted 4 years later, he is still waiting for an answer. Sadly, Godward was disappointed in love and in life, though he continued to employ Lily Pettigrew until 1898, when she finally married someone else. Wilson Steer would seem to be the luckier man. He and Rosie became officially engaged around 1894, the year he moved to a larger studio, which suggests a degree of prosperity that may have made marriage a realistic proposition. Self-Portrait with Model signals a shift in Steer's style and sensibility. Instead of a prim blue dress, Rosie wears nothing but a petticoat, which falls and flounces around her legs as she leans over to adjust her shoe, disconnected from the artist as her heavy hair conceals her face. Steer, too, appears oddly detached from his model. To paint the self-portrait, he had to work from the image reflected in a mirror, yet he crops his own figure in such a way that his head and hands, the markers of his identity, are lost from view. This fractured picture implies that all is not well in Steer's studio, and it seems to have been soon after it was made that Rosie returned his engagement ring. He persisted in trying to win her back, but the next year she married a violinist she'd met at the Guildhall School of Music, where she was using her earnings to take voice lessons. Years later, the novelist George Moore wrote that none would guess of Wilson Steer that his life had been illuminated by a love story. We pitied his suffering when the lady married. By then, the Whistlers no longer lived in London. They had moved to Paris early in 1892, following the path of Whistler's portrait of his mother, which had been acquired by the French state the previous December. Although Whistler found other models to pose for his pictures, none could compare to the Mrs. Pettigrew, and whenever a lithograph fell short of his standard, he would complain to his printers that the fault lay in the models, who were only imperfect substitutes. The Pettigrews then not only posed as the artist's muse, but seem to have been in themselves fundamental to his creativity. In 1894, Beatrix Whistler fell ill with cancer, and she returned to London with her husband to seek medical attention. Perhaps to cheer his ailing wife, Whistler sought out Lily Pettigrew, for Rose by then was unavailable to pose. Whistler's painting of Lily, his first actual portrait of a Pettigrew, is a dark and cheerless image of the young girl who had once gallivanted around the studio in flowing drapery. By the time the work was finished, Beatrix was terminally ill, and she died in May of 1896 after less than 10 years of marriage to the artist. Whistler kept the portrait of Lily in his studio for the rest of his life. Whistler also tried to engage her elder sister, but Hetty refused, insisting that she would never sit to anyone again. Yet she continued posing for Russell until 1909, when the artist's wife died and he immediately took up with the wealthy widow of a Scottish painter. Russell eventually married her, abandoning Hetty after a 20-year affair. This tiny etching, drawn on a scrap of a copper plate, marks the end of their relationship. Its title identifies Hetty as an art student rather than a model or a mistress, and just 2 years later, Hetty listed her occupation in the census as artist-sculptor, as she had in fact become. By then, she was living in Putney, the head of a household that included 4 other women, her 75-year-old mother, her elder sister Christina, her younger sister Florence, and her 12-year-old niece, Iris Hilda Pettigrew, who was actually Hetty's daughter, with Russell, born in 1899. Hetty Pettigrew died in 1953. Destitute, she was buried in an unmarked grave. We don't know what became of Lily, but her later life must also have been a struggle because the occupation listed on her husband's death certificate was street singer. Rosie, though, had a full life after the end of her modeling career. In 1947, she was discovered living in a suburb of London by Claire Bennett, who owned this painting by Wilson Steer called Jonquils, in which Rosie's profile is cast as a shadow on a dark window. Then in her mid-70s, Rosie Pettigrew had become, Bennett wrote, a beautiful little silver-haired old lady with sparkling brown eyes and an impudent, tip-tilted nose. Her late husband, Harry Waldo Warner, had been a founding member of the London String Quartet, and Rosie had traveled the world, accompanying him on tour. Their son, Ken Warner, had become a celebrated composer for the BBC. When Rosie saw Jonquils for the first time in over 50 years, she said only, "I didn't remember I could look so nice." But it was in gratitude to Bennett for bringing back happy memories of the 1890s that Rosie wrote her memoirs, presenting the sheaf of papers tied up in a ribbon. She died in 1958. I'd like to close with Oscar Wilde's wry conclusion to London models. He had once met Rosie Pettigrew in Whistler's studio and may have had her in mind when he wrote that English models are a well-behaved and hardworking class, and if they are more interested in artists than they are in art, a large section of the public is in the same condition, and most of our modern exhibitions seem to justify the choice. Thank you.